The gates of Topkapi Palace creak open beneath a moonless sky. Inside, silence stalks the marble corridors like a ghost. But in the shadows of the harem, you might hear the hush of slippered feet and feel the eyes of those who were never meant to be seen. They came from the far corners of empire, Ethiopia, the Balkans, the Caucasus, taken as children, stripped of everything, and made to serve. Not as slaves, not as men, not quite human in the eyes of the court. They were unmade. By the edge of a blade, futures were severed and bodies reshaped, so they could guard the Sultan's secrets, manage his harem, and whisper in the politics of a realm they could never truly belong to. Feared, trusted, pitied, forgotten. This is not a tale of power alone, but of pain buried beneath silk robes and screams silenced behind golden walls. This is the tragic story of service and silence. Imagine you are 9 years old, your world no larger than a village tucked into the hills of Ethiopia or the forests of Bosnia. You wake to birdsong and end the day chasing goats or carrying water for your mother. And then, one day, they come, slave traders, soldiers, or bandits. You are taken, and the boy you were is gone. For thousands of children, this was the beginning of a transformation that would end in a cold stone chamber, where their bodies would be altered beyond recognition. In the name of empire, in the name of obedience. The Ottoman Empire, at the height of its power, needed more than armies and gold to maintain its vast dominion. It needed eyes that never slept, lips that never spoke out of turn, hands that obeyed without question. It needed eunuchs. There were two kinds: the black eunuchs, primarily African boys brought through the Red Sea slave trade, and the white eunuchs, boys from Christian lands, often captured or sold during times of war and rebellion. The black eunuchs guarded the harem, the Sultan's most sacred inner sanctum. The white eunuchs managed state affairs, acting as scribes, treasurers, and sometimes spies. But before they could rise to such positions, their bodies had to be broken. The operation was brutal. Performed in unsanitary conditions, often with a single knife, both the penis and testicles were removed. Some were sewn shut afterward. The death rate was staggering. Estimates suggest up to 80% of boys did not survive the procedure. Those who lived did so with lifelong pain, hormonal disruption, and psychological wounds that no amount of wealth or influence could heal. The survivors were taken to palace schools. There, they were washed, renamed, and erased. Their identities, tribal, familial, religious, were stripped away, replaced with Ottoman discipline and the cold hierarchy of court life. They were taught languages, court etiquette, Islam, and the art of silent observation. They became instruments, not sons, not brothers, not men. The harem was no brothel, despite Western fantasies. It was a fortress of power, diplomacy, and bloodlines. Within it lived the Sultan's wives, concubines, daughters, and sisters. And it was guarded, physically and morally, by eunuchs. Who else could be trusted in a palace of women? The chief black eunuch, known as the Clar Aas, would rise to become one of the most powerful figures in the empire, wielding influence over the Sultan's household and often acting as a political advisor. But no matter how high a eunuch climbed, he could never father a child, never know romantic love, never truly be accepted as a full man in the empire he served. Their very existence was a contradiction. Mutilated to prevent temptation, yet entrusted with guarding royal flesh. Enslaved, yet often rising above free men in court rank. Their silence was their strength, and their curse. The grand gates of the imperial harem groaned shut like the mouth of a tomb, sealing behind them not just jewels and silks, but entire lives. For the eunuchs who walked these marble halls, life became a performance, a balancing act of obedience and authority, of invisibility and power. The moment you stepped into the harem as a eunuch, the rules of the outside world no longer applied. You lived in a kingdom within a kingdom, one ruled not by the Sultan, but by the women closest to him. Chief among them was the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, whose influence sometimes surpassed that of viziers and generals. To her, the chief black eunuch was both a servant and an ally, the keeper of her secrets and the enforcer of her will. But make no mistake, the life of an ordinary eunuch was not one of luxury. Many were housed in modest quarters just outside the women's chambers. Their days began before sunrise, offering prayers in silence, then preparing the harem for the day's rituals. They swept courtyards, organized the women's schedules, served meals, and relayed messages, often between lovers, enemies, and rivals. They had to memorize every relationship in the harem: who loved whom, who hated whom, who had fallen out of favor, and who was plotting to climb higher. And always, they watched. It was a dangerous game, not only for the women but for the eunuchs too. A whispered rumor, a wrongly delivered note, a misread glance could cost a concubine her life and a eunuch his post, or worse. Trust was rare, and betrayal was constant. Yet amid the intrigue, eunuchs found ways to rise. Some became masters of manipulation. Without wives or children to tie them down, eunuchs were seen as impartial, their loyalties tethered only to the palace. Over time, they became confidants of the Sultan, handling the empire's most intimate matters. The chief black eunuch held the keys to the harem, literally and figuratively. His seal was as powerful as a minister's. His word, law within the palace walls. Yet even as he held such influence, he remained an outsider. No matter how educated, eloquent, or loyal a eunuch became, he could never truly belong. He could not dine with the men of court, nor enter the military, nor leave a legacy of blood. His rise was vertical, but his roots were severed. His power was borrowed, conditional, granted by proximity, not by blood or birth. And what of identity? What did it mean to exist in a body that was neither fully male nor female, in a world that saw you as neither slave nor free, neither threat nor peer? Many eunuchs, especially those brought from Africa, lost their language, their religion, their very names. They were renamed with Turkish or Arabic titles: Haji, Mehmet, Ali, Nasser. Their stories before the palace faded like smoke in the morning. They wore turbans and robes, but no sword hung at their side. Their voices were soft. Their bodies carried the trauma of surgery and isolation. Some found solace in scholarship. The palace libraries were vast, and the eunuchs had access to books that most outside could never dream of. They studied Persian poetry, Arabic theology, Greek philosophy. Some became poets themselves, composing verses about longing, exile, and silence. Others poured themselves into religion. Many black eunuchs took the pilgrimage to Mecca, becoming Haji and returning with new status. They built mosques and schools, endowed charities. It was a way of reclaiming purpose in a world that had stripped them of everything. But even in piety, there was pain. Imagine standing before the Kaaba, Islam's holiest site, knowing that you would never have a son to carry your name, never feel the warmth of a lover's touch without fear or shame. Imagine serving a sultan who sired dozens of children while you washed his linens and watched over his wives. And yet, for all their suffering, eunuchs were not only victims. Some became architects of fate. In times of succession crisis, it was often the chief eunuch who decided which prince would rise. In moments of imperial scandal, it was the eunuch who silenced the whispers. In matters of poison, pregnancy, or palace coup, it was the eunuch who held the last word. They had become both jailers and captives, wielders of authority and symbols of submission. And behind every command, every bowed head, every set of quiet eyes, was a story. A boy once loved by a mother. A language once spoken beneath the stars. A future that had once seemed so vast, and now narrowed into silence. In the end, life in the harem for an Ottoman eunuch was not just a job. It was a transformation, spiritual, physical, psychological. It was a life carved out of trauma, painted over with robes and rituals. A life of great influence, yes, but one paid for in flesh. By the 19th century, The sun that once blazed over the Ottoman Empire had begun to dim. European powers crept ever closer. The printing press whispered new ideas into the ears of the elite. Steamships replaced caravans. Empires no longer ruled by scimitars and harems, but by railways, treaties, and telegrams. And with this shift, the world began to look differently at the eunuch. The once feared guardians of the Sultan's innermost world were now regarded with a mix of curiosity and condescension. Western diplomats and Orientalist writers, invited into Topkapi's opulent, decaying halls, wrote lurid descriptions of the eunuchs, portraying them as exotic relics, living fossils of a barbaric past. Black-skinned, voiceless, and robed in silk, they were reduced to caricatures. Tragic, grotesque, or comical. Not quite men. Not quite real. But within those caricatures were real men, aging in silence. Many eunuchs who had once wielded power found themselves increasingly sidelined. The Tanzimat reforms, sweeping through the empire in the mid-1800s, promised modernization and bureaucracy. The harem itself, once the pulsating heart of palace intrigue, became an outdated institution, its political function eroded by parliaments and Western diplomacy, and yet the eunuchs remained. Until the very end, they still moved through the corridors of Dolmabahce Palace, the new imperial residence by the Bosphorus. They still bowed low to princesses and managed letters from concubines. But their influence waned. The chief black eunuch was no longer a feared kingmaker. He was a relic in a world that no longer needed shadows to rule. Then came the war. World War I shattered the old empires. The Ottoman realm crumbled under its own weight, hastened by internal revolt and external invasion. The Sultanate was abolished in 1922. The Caliphate followed in 1924. And with it, the eunuchs vanished into the folds of history. There was no ceremony, no farewell. Some were given modest pensions by the new Turkish Republic. Others were cast out, no longer needed, no longer welcome in the bright, secular world Ataturk was forging. A few died in poverty. Others, with nowhere else to go, remained in the shadowy corners of crumbling palaces, living ghosts among fading murals and cracked tiles. One of the last known Ottoman eunuchs, Hak Mustafa AA, lived well into the 20th century. He had served in both Topkapi and Dolmabahce, rising to become a respected elder among his dwindling circle. He was blind in one eye and moved slowly with age, but he still wore his robes with pride, still prayed 5 times a day, still recited poetry from memory. He never spoke of the surgery, never spoke of his family before the palace. When asked about his past, he simply said, "I served." And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all. For every eunuch who passed through those imperial gates, whether he rose high or remained at the base of the pyramid, there existed a life unrecorded, a voice unheard, a pain never acknowledged. History remembers the names of sultans and generals. Rarely does it pause for the nameless men who carried their secrets, but their legacy endures. Architecturally, it can be seen in the mosques and fountains built with the wealth eunuchs acquired. Some became endowers of great religious schools and charitable institutions, especially in Mecca and Medina. Spiritually, their influence remains etched into the power structures they helped uphold. The intimacy of monarchy, the intertwining of domestic life and imperial politics, the silent corridors of influence. And psychologically, perhaps most profoundly, the story of the eunuchs challenges our ideas of power, gender, loyalty, and loss. What does it mean to have immense authority, but no legacy? To be trusted with the Sultan's family, yet forbidden from having one of your own? To wield the keys of empire, yet be seen as incomplete? Eunuchs lived in the space between categories. Not male in the traditional sense, yet not female. Not slaves, yet not free. Not family, yet closer to the throne than most blood relatives. They were made into symbols by an empire that needed both their absence and their presence. And in that contradiction lies the tragedy. They were not born eunuchs. They were made. By blades, by politics, by the unrelenting machinery of empire. Their sacrifice was not one they chose. It was carved into them. Now, their quarters are empty. Their names, mostly lost. The voices that once whispered through silk-draped halls have fallen silent. Yet if you walk the marble corridors of Topkapi or peer into the deserted rooms of Dolmabahce, you may still feel it, a lingering presence. The memory of footsteps that once never dared echo. The gaze of eyes trained never to blink. And somewhere in the golden light filtering through a lattice window, you might remember them, not as shadows, but as men who suffered, men who served, men who were unmade. If this story moved you, share it, not just to reveal a forgotten corner of history, but to honor the unheard voices lost in the folds of empire. Like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more immersive journeys into the untold and the unseen. Let us keep history breathing, not through thrones and conquests, but through the people whose silence shaped the world.